chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Zach.
Good morning.
Go ahead and turn your Bibles
to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. It's good to have our guests with us today. We're pleased that you're here. I've met some of you, and some of you are here a second or third time, and we're glad to have you with us as well. I noticed Janice Tukendorf's grandparents are with us this morning from Arizona, and we're glad to have them. They've come a long way, and I know the grandkids are happy to see them and be a part of, have them a part of their life for this week. Let me mention again Tuesday's class. I mentioned it last week. It's 10 o'clock Tuesday morning for those of you who can participate in it. It's studying the names of God, and these two ladies will do a good job of touching this subject because of their own scholarship, and they're both very good Bible students. And I would just encourage you, if your schedules are free, to plug into that and be blessed by it. I have mentioned last week Lipscomb Live. Later this month, it's next month. It's the 13th and 14th of October. Lipscomb is going to send some of their Bible professors to Chicago to hold a seminar having to do with reaching the younger generation, reaching the young adults. Now, we've got a good crop of young adults, but we could do better, and we could do a better job at meeting their needs. And I hope that we have a good representation there, because this is something that they've really worked on to try to address the issue. And it's going to be held at Naperville, and then in the evening there's going to be a reception in downtown Chicago by the university president and his wife. And I hope that we have a good representation for that. Also, I need to mention to you that one of the reasons we're not having Chicago Celebration is because of the fact the Midwest lectures are happening, and so much energy is going into that. But there is an effort not to miss out on it completely, and to have a smaller effort. And so there is going to be what's called the Fifth Sunday Celebration. And it's a gathering of Christians from primarily the west and northwestern part of the Chicago area. And it'll be at a West Suburban congregation, this first one, on September 30th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The format is going to be very much similar to Chicago Celebration, with speakers from the Spanish community, the African-American community, and the Anglo community. And I would encourage Cardinal Drive to be a part of that. It's going to be a good day. It will not be as big as Chicago Celebration, but it's an attempt to have some cross-cultural fellowship with each other and to keep these relationships alive. And I admonish you to make a plan to be a part of that. I'm seeing if I missed anything. Won't you stand up and greet somebody near you? We're living in an information age, or so the experts tell us. In fact, theoretically, there's more knowledge available today than any time since the world began. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what we're being told. And it makes sense because there's more happening, more history, more science being discovered. At least it's available to us today in ways it's never been available to us before. There are more people in search of knowledge. There's more people in the business of processing knowledge. Information technology is a major, major economic business today. And more people are more informed, more knowledgeable, we are told, than they've ever been before. But I sometimes wonder about that. You know, I often hear knowledge being generously and shared, and I find myself wanting to stop the generous benefactor of that knowledge and ask the question, how do you know? This information is being given as though it's absolutely true, but how do you know? Where does that come from? What's the resource behind it? There seems to be a glut of free information. It's all around us. The internet, of course, is a major source for that. You Google almost anything and you get millions of hits, not just hundreds of thousands of hits that you got 10 years ago, but millions of hits, sometimes billions of hits, and there's no way in the world you can read all of that. It's overwhelming. And yet at the same time, there's an insatiable hunger, it seems, for more knowledge. And it's evidenced in a variety of ways. Talk radio shows are just all the rage in small towns all across this country, and it's even made it into major metropolitan centers like Chicago as well. But these individuals who lead these talk radio shows are experts dispensing freely so-called knowledge. They're so-called experts. And people listen. And the reason they listen is because they want knowledge. There's a hunger for knowledge. And all this has kind of made its way, it's migrated into the TV world as well. And of course, it's taken a variety of different forms. Dr. Phil has been around for at least a generation. He's starting to get long in the tooth. And then there's, of course, The View, which is newer and has a very dedicated following, and a lot of imitators as well. And Rock Center is one of the newer productions. It's major primetime news program, I put that in quotation marks, but it's about information. Long-established venues of information, of course, the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, but newspapers like this all across the country today are really struggling to stay alive because of these vast variety of competition of other sources of information and knowledge. And they're tabloids galore. And they market what we might call as forbidden knowledge, gossip, and rumors, and all kind of information, truths that cannot be substantiated usually, and they don't feel the need to. Preachers even get into the act. Sometimes we're pressured to prove expert on every subject. But I'm not an expert on every subject, and I don't aspire to be. And in matters of religion, everybody from NFL stars to soap opera queens get into the business of pontificating on religion, sometimes at the level appropriate only to apostles. And people buy and listen. Sometimes I want to gag. And I want to ask the question again, how do you know? How do you know? What is the source of this information you're distributing so generously? What's the origin of this knowledge? Well, I've always heard that. I've always believed that. Well, I just feel that. I don't know, but it just seems right to me. Everybody says. Everybody knows that. Well, you know, they say. And then there's a pious variety. The Lord showed me that. The Lord told me that. The Lord led me to the conviction that. Or the Lord spoke to my heart. And the list goes on, but a question still persists. How do you know? What is the source behind this knowledge? It's a very important question regarding knowledge. And it's a primary question, a fundamental question in the realm of religious knowledge. And so on the basis of all of that we've just talked about, thought about, I want us to go to the text. Luke chapter 1. Luke, you remember, is the author of the Gospel of Luke and also Acts. They're like two volumes of one work. Both volumes were addressed to a man by the name of Theophilus, who's a friend or acquaintance. He begins by saying, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught? What is the source of this knowledge? That question must be our first one. What is the source of this knowledge? The question represents a whole realm of study, of doctrine, of philosophy, and the name for it is epistemology. Now, epistemology is a $50 word for a 5-cent concept. But basically, epistemology deals with the question, what is the source of this knowledge? What is the basis of this understanding? And it's a legitimate question. Incidentally, it's a question that is at the heart of the Wednesday evening class that Wes Cunningham is leading. The Truth Project raises some very legitimate questions that need to be asked and wrestled with in the context of our today, in the context of our social setting. And this material is very good at addressing this question. But it has to do with what is truth, what is behind the truth, what's the basis of that truth, and how do we accept it and know that it's right? In other words, how do you know? In our text, Luke outlines the basis for what he has written. It's based on the testimony of eyewitnesses. It's based on compiled narratives. Some others have already written about this event, about the story of Jesus, and it's about his own careful research. So he wants his reader, Theophilus, to know the background behind what he's telling them. He wants him to know the resources from which he is drawing in order to deliver this message. Peter, in his second letter, also provides his readers with a declaration of what's behind his testimony. He puts it this way. He said, "We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of His majesty." In other words, this is not just fairy dust here. I saw it. I saw Him. I was there. And so what I'm telling you is from an eyewitness point of view. When Paul wrote to the Galatian church, it was important to Paul that his students understand the source of what he was delivering to them. In fact, he says, "I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ." In other words, this is not just stuff I've heard. This is not rumor. I wasn't even told this by somebody who knew Jesus, but Jesus Himself gave this to me. I got it from the source Himself. And so you can have confidence in it. And then we come to John's Gospel. And John begins his Gospel by saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made, and without Him there was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. And the light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not understood it." Or some translation says, "has not overcome it." And then he says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Notice again, he's eyewitness. He says, "We have seen His glory. We have seen Him." In his letter, he goes on to say, "We have touched Him. Our hands have handled Him." This is something that we know personally about. And so the question, how do you know, is not a frivolous or unreasonable question, but rather it's a judicious one. And every one of these writers took great pains to make sure that their readers understood the source of the information they were delivering to them. It's also confirmed by warnings that we receive in Scripture, warning us not to be gullible. When Paul wrote to the Colossians, Christians just like us, he said to them, "Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you for the prize. Such a person goes in great detail about what he has seen. His unspiritual mind puffs him up with idle notions. don't you just believe every idea that comes along. Don't you let somebody lead you astray and disqualify you from getting the prize that's yours. Don't allow that to happen. Don't be gullible. John says very much the same thing in different words. He says, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. You need to make sure of the source behind the knowledge. You need to make sure that it's true, not just because the person's saying it, because there are those who will lead you astray if you allow them to do that. So determining the source is a crucial matter. The question is, how do you know? Who is the bearer of the knowledge is also important, but it's also important how we relate to that individual. We don't have to look very far before we find a host of so-called experts. There's a story that's told of a 1930s actress by the name of Billie Burke. She was a big screen actress, a star at the time. And it said that while she was on an ocean liner traveling across the Atlantic, she looked over in the dining car to one of the other people on the cruise, and she noticed that he seemed to be suffering from a cold. And so she asked him, are you uncomfortable? And he acknowledged he was. And so she went on to say, well, I'll tell you what to do. She said, go to your stateroom and drink a lot of orange juice. And take 2 aspirins. And then find as many blankets as you can and cover up with those blankets and sweat out the cold. She said, I know what I'm talking about. And by the way, I'm Billie Burke from Hollywood. Well, he smiled. He says, thank you. He says, I'm Dr. William Mayo of the Mayo Clinic. That sort of reminds me of a contemporary spoof done by Alec Baldwin on a Capital One commercial. Listen.
What's in your wallet? It's okay. I've played a pilot before.
I'm sure you've seen that. I've played a pilot before. Well, if we go back to our original text, we find that the writer is a friend of Theophilus, who's the one to whom this letter is addressed. And as we continue to read, we learn that he is also a companion of Paul, and he had traveled with Paul. He was a physician. He was an individual of scholarship and learning and research, and he was by nature driven to make sure that his sources were what they needed to be. But please notice the messenger does not rank at the same place as the source does. And so he refers people back to the source so they'll understand that this message did not originate with him. He wants them to know the real source. There are 3 principles, at least, that come into play here. The first principle is that truth should not be discarded simply because of its messenger or bearer. We're inclined to do that. If we have a prejudice against somebody, then we're inclined to just kind of write them off, whatever they say, without even considering it. Or if we don't like someone, we're inclined to do that. Or if we've had trouble between us, we're inclined to do that. We just kind of write them off. Jesus makes it clear that's not a good policy. In fact, he one time was speaking to his disciples, and he said, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must obey them and do everything they tell you. He says, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. In other words, in spite of the fact that these teachers' lives were lives of shame to their position, Jesus was making clear that the message they're proclaiming is true because it has divine origin. And so you need to not discard it simply because they said it, but rather you need to obey it. Well, the second principle is kind of the opposite of that. And that is, so-called truth should not be adopted simply because of its messenger or its bearer. Sometimes we're inclined to do that too. We like a person. We have confidence in the person. We have a good relationship with the person. So if they tell us something, we say, oh, well, it must be true. Well, that's not always true either. Paul, in talking to the Galatians, he says, even if we or an angel of heaven should preach to you another gospel than the one that we preached to you, let him be eternally condemned. In other words, even if I come to you and start telling you something else, don't you believe it. Don't believe it just because I say so. You make sure that it's true. Now, that same would apply with me and you. Don't accept something just because I say so, even though you like me, if you like me, because it may not be true, so you check it out. That's a principle that's fundamental to this whole question, how do you know? Then, addressing the Corinthians, he makes it clear that even prophets speaking with a message purported to be from God, even they are to be critiqued to see whether it's true or not. He says 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. In other words, you pay attention to it, you check it out. It's not something you swallow hook, line, and sinker just because somebody says they're speaking from God. You cannot, therefore, just assume that the individual is speaking from God. The third principle is something that's important for us to know. As truth bearer, we must recognize that our credibility will affect the reception of our message. In other words, if our credibility suffers, then people will be more reluctant to accept the message that we want to give to them. Peter advised his readers, just a great, great text. He said, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. In other words, even though the pagans they have a tendency to write us off, to speak badly of us, you live such good lives, they can't deny it. And one day they will come to accept the message you're sharing with them, even though they don't want to, but your life becomes just absolute proof that what you're saying is true. Of course, he then spoke to the wives of unbelievers and told them much the same thing. Your husbands may not believe the message being preached, but they may very well be converted by your life because it's so holy and it's so godly in the way it is. Now, one question that I personally must ask is, what is the charge, my charge, relative to this knowledge? If there is knowledge and I know it, what is my responsibility? Well, that's a very important question, but it's not one that I can answer for you. It's a question that you must wrestle with on your own and answer for yourself. But it's clear from our text that Luke accepted as his charge to write an orderly account. And his purpose was so that Theophilus could know the certainty of the things he had been taught. He very much wanted Theophilus to be a disciple who had confidence in the gospel. He wanted that for Theophilus, and Luke had the wherewithal to help that happen, to help it become a reality. And so he gave himself to the task of writing this orderly account in order to assure the fact that Luke would be certain about his faith. We find much the same kind of spirit in John's gospel. Right at the end of his gospel, as he closes it out, he says, Jesus did many of the things that are not written in this book, but he said, these were written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. John was not just on a frivolous, idle project in his retirement, just trying to put in his time. John was on a mission. He wanted people who did not know the message to know the message, but he wanted them to know it in such a way that they would become believers and they would be saved, just as Jesus Christ had died to save them. He wanted that, and so he gave himself to the task. He had taken on a mission. There's no difference between Jews and Gentiles. The same Lord is the Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then, Paul says, can they call on one whom they've not heard? How can they believe in one of whom they've not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they're sent? The obvious implication that Paul is stressing is that your knowledge charges you with a responsibility to send that knowledge to others. That's why this congregation is involved in Honduras. That's why this congregation is involved in Eastern European missions. That's why this congregation is involved in the ministry in Ghana. And hopefully, as years pass, we will have other outreaches where even though people are a long way away, we're about the task of sending the message because of this responsibility that's given because of our own knowledge. James makes a different point using the same logic of responsibility. His point, however, is that knowing carries with itself the responsibility of doing. Anyone attempting to deny that the principle of responsibility then is self-deceived. If we know something, then we're held responsible for doing according to what we know. Jesus simply put it this way: now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. I don't know where you are in relationship to information gathering, but I would encourage you to critique it. I would encourage you to assume a responsibility of asking the question, what is the source of this? Rather than just simply swallowing it whole. That's true whether it comes from the radio or television or newspapers, the gossip chain that flows about, or whether it comes from me. I would encourage you to ask the question, what is the source of this knowledge? How do you know? I believe that's our responsibility as individuals to whom God has given a mind of our own, to whom God has given us the resources to check out and to check credentials, to check resources. I would encourage you to assume that responsibility. But in addition to that, I would encourage you to ask the question, now that I know, what responsibility do I have as far as sending is concerned and sharing is concerned? What responsibility does that place on my shoulders? With my friends, with my family, with my neighbors, with my community, and even to a larger extent with my world. You need to respond this morning by confessing Jesus Christ as Lord and being buried with him in baptism. I would encourage you to come to the front. Let us know your need. If you need to be baptized into Christ, the water's ready, be a good day. If you need to respond in some other way this morning, let us know what your need is as we stand and sing. I appreciate the people that work in the technology booth. They always bless us. And I apologize to Catherine. I missed a segment of my sermon this morning, and I'm sure she was scrambling, trying to keep up on the slides. So that scramble was not her fault. That was my fault. And I appreciate the work she does. My challenge to you, again, is to consider carefully your own responsibility of truth. And I would encourage you to come to this Wednesday night class and and be a part of this discussion. It's really a kind of heavy class, but it's really rich, and I would encourage you to plug in and be a part of it.